The silver spoon clicked once against the china, and nobody at the table breathed. I was standing 3 steps behind the last chair with a wine towel folded over my wrist when Nikolai Volkov looked down at the plate that had taken 6 people 40 minutes to build, then touched the edge of the lamb with his fork as if it had personally offended him. The private dining room glowed in low amber light, all walnut walls and crystal reflections, the kind of room designed to flatter money and hide fear. It did neither tonight. The rosemary steam had already gone thin in the air. Butter was cooling on porcelain. One of the bodyguards near the door shifted his weight, and the leather of his shoulder holster gave a small creak that sounded far too loud in the silence. Nikolai lifted one bite to his mouth, chewed once, maybe twice, and set the fork down with the calm precision of a man placing a signature on someone else's ending. No curse, no raised voice. That made it worse. The chef beside me, a man whose name had been printed in magazines and spoken with admiration in rooms far gentler than this one, stared at the plate as if maybe the food would somehow defend him. It didn't. Nikolai pushed the dish forward 2 inches. That was all. A tiny movement over white linen. But in that room, it landed like a verdict. "Take it away," he said. His voice never climbed. It just cut straight through the candlelight. The chef swallowed hard. "Mr. Volkov, if you'd allow me, I can prepare another course. Something lighter, or perhaps with less. I didn't ask for another course." Nikolai dabbed his fingers with his napkin, even though they were perfectly clean. He was a big man, broad through the shoulders. Dark suit fitted so sharply it looked poured onto him, but there was nothing indulgent about him. Every line was controlled. Even his stillness felt expensive and dangerous. He glanced at the untouched wine, then back at the plate, not with disgust exactly, but with distance. Like he had already decided that whatever anyone brought him tonight would arrive too late. "This is the 3rd time this month," said Victor, the house manager, his voice trembling at the edges despite all his effort to keep it smooth. He wasn't speaking to Nikolai so much as into the room, as if naming the number might soften it. It didn't. Nikolai leaned back in his chair. The fire in the stone hearth snapped softly behind him, orange light catching the hard plane of his cheekbone, and for the first time I noticed the deeper strangeness in the scene. He wasn't angry because the food was bad. The lamb had been perfect, pink at the center, crust fragrant with garlic and crushed pepper. The potatoes were silk. The sauce smelled rich enough to make any normal man close his eyes for a second. But Nikolai had not eaten like a hungry man. He had examined, tested, dismissed. He looked at every plate the same way a jeweler looks at a fake diamond, searching for the lie before he even touched it. The chef found his voice again, though it came out dry. "Sir, I was told you wanted the best in the city." "I did." Nikolai rose from his chair, and the room seemed to stand with him, even those of us who never moved. He was taller than I had realized sitting down. He adjusted one cuff, not hurried, not theatrical. "That is why your failure is expensive." No one spoke. I could smell wax from the candles, smoke from the hearth, and the sharp mineral scent of the chilled water, sweating inside crystal glasses. My own fingers tightened around the towel until the fabric pressed into my palm. The chef's face had gone pale under the warm light. He had probably imagined many endings to this dinner before walking in. Praise, relief, negotiation. Not this cool, almost bored erasure. "You're dismissed," Nikolai said. Just that. No explanation. No appeal. The words dropped into the room and stayed there. The chef blinked as if he hadn't heard correctly. "Dismissed from tonight." Nikolai looked at him, then, fully, and something in the air seemed to lower by 10 degrees. "From my house. From my table. From any kitchen that carries my recommendation." That hit harder than a shout ever could. I saw it happen in the chef's body first. The stiff jaw loosening, the shoulders losing structure, the quick flick of his eyes toward Victor, toward the bodyguards, toward the door he suddenly had to use as a smaller man than the one who came in. His reputation was gone before the plate had even cooled. In this city, men like Nikolai didn't merely stop calling. They changed what doors opened after that. The chef gave one shallow nod, because dignity was the last possession left to him, then turned and walked out with measured steps over the thick Persian rug while the scent of his ruined masterpiece lingered behind him like a humiliation that refused to leave. Nobody moved until the door clicked shut. The candles kept burning. The lamb kept steaming faintly. Nikolai remained standing at the head of the table, one hand resting on the chair back, eyes on nothing any of us could see. That was the moment the truth settled over the room, heavy and cold. This was no longer a search for flavor or talent or technique. 3 of the finest chefs in 1 month had entered this house carrying brilliance on silver trays, and all 3 had left stripped of it after a single bite. The emptiness at this table was deeper than appetite. It had shape, routine, ritual, as if each dinner was less a meal than a trial no one could pass. Victor cleared his throat, softly this time. "We can call someone else, sir. There are others." Nikolai's mouth moved, not quite into a smile. "No," he said. He looked at the untouched courses lined in perfect order beneath the chandelier's glow, every garnish exact, every sauce polished, every surface beautiful enough to belong in a museum rather than under a knife. Then he said the sentence none of us would forget. "No chef can fix what isn't hunger." He picked up his coat from the back of the chair, and when the wool brushed the candlelit air, I caught a trace of cedar and winter on it. He walked toward the door without taking another bite, without asking for dessert, without pretending for anyone's comfort. His men fell in behind him at once. Victor stepped aside, so quickly his polished shoe scraped the floor. I stayed where I was, staring at the abandoned plate and the fork laid beside it, at the small crescent bite missing from perfection. A dead room, a dead appetite, a man with everything in front of him and nothing that could reach him. Then Nikolai stopped with his hand on the brass handle and spoke without turning around. "Tomorrow night," he said, "I'm dining out." The room lifted its head in one silent pulse. Not because we were relieved, because now his emptiness was leaving the house, and somewhere beyond those doors, another table was about to learn what it cost to fail him. Rain had polished the city into black glass by the time the private entrance of Marcelli's opened for men who never waited in lines. Warm lights spilled across the wet pavement in long gold bars, and the cold carried the smell of gasoline, truffle oil, and damp wool. Inside, crystal trembled softly against linen as the dining room was cleared with the kind of speed that only fear could produce. Clara stood near the service station with a tray balanced against her palm, watching servers straighten forks already straight and smooth napkins already perfect, every movement sharpened by the same rumor moving through the room without needing a voice. He was coming here because nowhere else had been enough. Marcelli's was the sort of place that sold performance before food. Candle flames burned low inside smoked glass cups. The walls held dark walnut panels that swallowed sound, and the air above the open kitchen carried butter, seared rosemary, wine reduction, and the bright metallic hiss of copper pans taking heat. At the center of it all stood the chef brought in for the night, a man whose photograph hung in magazines by the host stand, his white coat stiff as paper, his jaw tight enough to crack. He was shouting in a low voice at the line cooks, not because they were failing, but because panic needed somewhere to land. Clara had seen that look before on men who lived one insult away from cruelty. Water before words. The floor manager snapped as he passed her, one hand pressing his earpiece into place. "You do not speak unless spoken to. You do not look at him too long. And you," he added, turning fully now as his eyes dropped to her shoes, sensible and polished, but old at the seams, "stay invisible tonight. One wrong move, and you're done." The sentence landed harder because he did not raise his voice. Around them, servers lowered their eyes at once, grateful the blade had chosen someone else. Clara said nothing. She adjusted the cuff of her black uniform where the thread had started to loosen and felt the heat from the kitchen lick one side of her face while the draft from the front door chilled the other. Poverty had taught her the mathematics of silence. It had also taught her how quickly people confuse silence with smallness. The motorcade arrived like weather. First the headlights washed over the frosted front windows, then the radios at the security podium crackled. Then the host himself hurried forward with both hands clasped too tightly in front of him. When Nikolai Volkov entered, The room did not freeze so much as rearrange itself around him. Black coat, charcoal suit, no wasted motion. Rain shone along one shoulder before one of his men took the coat away. He did not look around for admiration. Men like him never needed proof of what the room already knew. But Clara saw what others missed because they were too busy being frightened by the obvious. Victor was not there tonight, yet the same atmosphere had arrived before Nikolai did. Not hunger, not pleasure, but a test no one understood how to pass. The chef came out personally to greet him, offering words about a custom tasting menu, imported shellfish, aged balsamic, a veal reduction finished with 20-year sherry. Nikolai listened with the patience of a locked door. His expression did not change. The manager laughed too quickly at nothing. A woman at table 12 stopped mid-sip, pretending not to stare. Clara stepped forward with the water service when signaled, the heavy bottle cold against her fingers, and poured into Nikolai's glass. He did not thank her. He did not ignore her either. His gaze passed once over her face and moved on, not dismissive, simply unreadable. That was somehow stranger. Around him, his men remained standing until he sat. Only then did the dining room begin breathing again. The first course left the kitchen under a silver dome. Hamachi with citrus vapor and edible flowers, arranged so delicately it looked more embalmed than prepared. Clara carried bread to a nearby table and watched from the corner of her vision as the dome was lifted. Several guests in the room leaned into the silence as if this were theater. Nikolai picked up his fork, touched the fish once, took a bite, and laid the utensil down. No speech, no drama. The chef's nostrils flared. The plate was removed. The second course went out hotter, louder, richer. Wild mushroom agnolotti in brown butter. The aroma deep and expensive, sage crackling softly in the pan before plating. A line cook crossed himself before the runner took it. Clara nearly would have laughed if the room had not felt so close to breaking. This time Nikolai tasted, chewed once, set down his fork, and reached for his water instead. The manager's face lost color so fast it looked wiped away. Table 7 needs fresh wine, another server whispered to Clara, but his eyes stayed fixed on Nikolai's table. Nobody cared about Table 7 anymore. The chef stormed to the pass and began tearing into his sous chef under his breath, blaming salt, timing, plating, everyone but the deeper truth clawing at the room. Clara carried a basket of bread through the corridor beside the kitchen and caught 2 prep cooks talking where the steam fogged the metal shelves. "Third place this month," one murmured. "If he walks on this menu too, that's another career buried." The other gave a humorless smile. "Not buried, erased." Clara kept walking, though the words stayed with her. By the time the main course was fired, all pretense had fallen away. The chef no longer cooked for excellence. He cooked for survival. Butter foamed violently in the pan. Time smoked on the grill. Someone dropped a spoon, and a clang on the tile made 3 people jump. The plate that emerged belonged on a magazine cover. Dry-aged filet, bone marrow glaze, poems anise stacked like architecture. The manager himself carried it out, shoulders pinned back, smile arranged, as if confidence could season meat. Clara was refilling candles near the back wall when Nikolai cut a piece, lifted it, paused, and let the bite fall back to the plate. Not rejected with anger, rejected with absence. That was worse. The chef came out before anyone could stop him. "Sir," he said, voice stretched tight, "if there is a problem with the preparation, I can correct it personally." Nikolai finally looked at him. The room seemed to lean in all at once, candlelight trembling across glass stems and polished knives. "That," he said quietly, glancing at the plate as though it were merely evidence, "is the problem. Everything here is trying too hard to be believed." No one moved. Not the chef. Not the manager. Not even the violinist tucked near the bar, whose bow hovered above the strings without touching them. The insult was not to one dish. It was to the whole beautiful machinery of the place. Then the manager turned, and because humiliation seeks a weaker body when it cannot strike upward, his eyes found Clara. She had stopped with the candle snuffer in her hand, one wick still smoking a thin gray thread into the warm air. "Why are you standing there?" he hissed as he crossed to her, fingers digging into her elbow. "Move. Smile. Do your job." Several nearby guests looked away out of habit. The old social reflex of pretending not to witness cruelty when it wears a tailor jacket. Clara steadied the tray against her hip and pulled her arm back with one small movement. "I am doing it," she said, not loudly, but clearly enough that the words carried farther than the manager intended. His face hardened. "Girls like you should be grateful to carry plates in a room like this." The sentence landed in full view now, in the polished hush, under chandeliers bright as ice. Poor, replaceable, decorative if silent, disposable if not. Clara felt every eye in the radius of the candlelight without needing to turn toward them. She could smell scorched butter from the kitchen and expensive perfume from the nearest table, two worlds pressing against each other until one had to yield. But this time she did not lower her head. At Nikolai's table, the untouched main course cooled beneath the lights, glaze stiffening, steam gone. He had returned to stillness, but the room around him had exposed itself completely. The chef's vanity, the manager's cowardice, the terror stitched beneath luxury. And Clara, standing in her plain black uniform with a red mark already rising where she had been grabbed, understood that by the end of the night, Marcelli's would remember exactly who had been allowed to speak and who had not. Silver covers caught the chandelier light and sent it back in cold flashes across the table, while the last of the rejected sauce gathered a dull skin under the heat lamps. Somewhere beyond the dining room doors, a pan rang once against steel, then silence sealed over it again. Clara stayed where the floor manager had left her, one step behind the line of candlelight, close enough to clear a plate if ordered, far enough to be forgotten if the room got what it wanted. The red mark on her wrist still burned beneath her cuff, but something steadier had taken hold of her attention now. Not the insult, not the famous chef unraveling in the kitchen. Nikolai Volkov. From that distance, he did not look like a man deciding whether dinner pleased him. He looked like a jeweler inspecting a counterfeit. His fingers moved first, never his appetite. He turned the fork slightly, pressed the tines into the edge of the meat, watched the juices gather, lifted a fragment no bigger than a coin, and held it beneath his nose without closing his eyes, without leaning toward it, without any hunger at all. Then he touched it to his tongue as if fulfilling a formal requirement, set the fork down, and let the bite remain unfinished on the porcelain. Around him, crystal trembled softly each time a server passed. The air smelled of truffle oil, seared veal, expensive wine breathing in decanters. None of it seemed to reach him. Clara had seen wealthy men perform boredom before. They liked to prove that nothing on the table could impress them. This was different. Nikolai wasn't trying to dominate the meal. He was testing it for sincerity and finding theater instead. Another course arrived under a silver dome, carried by two waiters whose sleeves had gone damp at the wrists. The lid came off with a flourish too elegant for the silence it entered. Saffron steam lifted. A stripe of sauce shone like lacquer. Edible flowers, tweezed into place with surgical care, leaned over a cut of fish so perfect it seemed untouched by human hands. The famous chef himself stepped out just far enough to watch from the doorway, face powdered pale by heat and fear. Nikolai studied the plate, not with disgust, with distance. His thumb brushed the edge of the napkin once, slow, almost absent. Then he asked, in a voice so low the nearest candle seemed louder, "Who is this trying to convince?" No one answered. The chef mistook the question for a technical complaint and rushed forward with words about provenance, reduction time, imported stock, a farm in northern Italy, a finishing salt harvested by hand. Each explanation fell onto the table like another decoration no one had asked for. Clara watched Nikolai's eyes during all of it. They did not sharpen at the mention of ingredients. They dimmed. That was when the pattern turned clear in her mind. He was not rejecting flavor because he could not recognize quality. He was rejecting performance the instant he tasted it. Every plate arrived dressed like a promise and landed before him like a lie. He did not eat like a man without money, power, or access. He ate like a man who no longer believed anything could be plain and true. The realization came to her so suddenly that her hand stopped halfway to the water carafe. Tiny beads of condensation slipped across the cut crystal and chilled her fingers. At the far end of the room, one of Nikolai's men shifted his weight, leather creaking softly. The floor manager hissed at a busser for breathing too loudly. But the real movement had already happened, and only Clara seemed to feel it. The problem in front of Marcelli's was no longer a difficult guest. It was a man so emptied out that he checked each bite the way people check doors at night, expecting betrayal at the handle. Another plate was removed. Another appeared. Clara moved in with the others, silent, precise, the black soles of her shoes soundless on the polished floor. When she set fresh flatware near Nikolai's right hand, he did something none of the others seemed to notice. He did not look at the arrangement first. He looked at her hand, not at her face, at the hand itself, the chapped knuckles, the faint burn mark near her thumb, the cheap cuff stitched once by someone who could not afford replacement. His gaze dropped for only a second, then returned to the plate. But it was the first time all night he had looked at anything human before looking at the food. Clara drew her hand back slowly. Heat from the candles brushed one side of her face. The draft from the kitchen cooled the other. On the plate before him sat a tower of braised short rib over parsnip silk, ringed with black garlic glaze, built upward like architecture. He cut into it. He chewed once, twice. Nothing changed in him. Then he took his napkin, placed it beside the plate with exact care, and said, "Food shouldn't need a costume." The words did not land like anger. They landed like judgment. No one in the room moved at first. The chef blinked as if struck by a language he did not speak. The floor manager recovered only enough to force a laugh that died in his own throat. Clara stood still, but inside her the night shifted again. She had been ordered to disappear, yet now she understood something the powerful men, the famous chef, and the manager clutching at borrowed authority had all missed. Nikolai was not searching for rarity. He was searching for something unguarded, something that did not beg to be admired before it was believed. The next course waiting under the pass would fail too if it came dressed in gold and smoke. She knew it before it left the kitchen, and knowing it became its own danger, because once a truth had taken shape that sharply, silence no longer felt like obedience. It felt like watching a house fill with smoke while everyone complimented the chandelier. Behind the swinging doors, the chef shouted for the special tasting course to be fired immediately, a dish that took 6 hands, imported mushrooms, and a final tableside pour. Clara turned her head toward the kitchen, then back to the man at the center of the room, still seated in that terrible calm, surrounded by silver, crystal, and fear. For the first time all night, the question before her was no longer whether Marcelli's could survive his standards. It was whether anyone in that building dared bring him something that wasn't pretending. Porcelain met wood with a clean, humiliating click, and the sound traveled farther than the chef's last apology. Steam from the rejected main course curled into the cold chandelier light for a second before disappearing, as if even heat knew when it was no longer wanted. Behind the swinging kitchen doors, somebody cursed in Italian, a pan struck metal, and the rich smell of truffle butter turned suddenly sickening in the back of Clara's throat. She stood with a wine cloth draped over one wrist, watching the plate sit in front of Nikolai Volkov like evidence. He had not raised his voice. He had not even looked angry. That made the silence around him worse. The chef himself emerged from the kitchen, white jacket damp under the arms, his tweezers still in his breast pocket like a surgeon caught outside the operating room. With careful hands, he began describing the dish no one had asked him to defend anymore. Wild mushrooms flown in that morning, veal reduced for 18 hours, a smoked demi-glace poured tableside. Nikolai glanced at the dark ribbon of sauce spreading across the china, and then at the chef, his expression unchanged. "Food should not need a costume," he said, and the line landed harder than shouting. A waiter near Clara lowered his tray too quickly, and crystal chimed against crystal. The floor manager moved at once, smiled pasted on too tight, intercepting the disaster before it became visible. He leaned toward the chef, whispering through his teeth, then snapped his fingers toward the kitchen for another course, another performance, another lie in a prettier jacket. Clara looked from the ruined dignity of the chef to the untouched plate and felt the pressure settle into her bones. No one in that room was trying to feed the man at the table now. They were trying to survive him. The realization made the gilded room feel airless. Her shoes were still damp from the alley behind the restaurant where staff came in through the service entrance. The cheap sole pressed cold against the floor as she stepped once, then again, toward the center aisle before good sense could chain her back into place. The floor manager saw the movement instantly. His eyes flashed a warning sharp enough to cut skin. Stay invisible. But invisibility had already become another kind of dishonesty. Clara stopped beside the service station, fingers tightening around the folded cloth, and heard herself speak before the room could swallow the chance. "Clear the table," she said softly at first, then louder when no one moved. Several heads turned. The floor manager stared at her as if a chair had begun speaking. The chef looked offended before he looked frightened. Clara kept her eyes on the white expanse in front of Nikolai, the architecture of garnishes, silver, and wasted labor. "Take everything away," she said. "All of it." A draft slipped through the dining room as the kitchen door swung open and shut behind a passing runner, carrying with it the scorched scent of butter and the sharp green smell of cut herbs. It seemed impossible that her voice, plain and low, could now be the thing holding the room still. The floor manager crossed to her so quickly the heel of his shoe scraped the marble. "Back to your station," he muttered, smiling for the room while fury burned behind his teeth. "Now." Clara did not step back. "Give me 15 minutes, she said, and this time she looked past him, directly at the man at the head of the table. "Not for another special. Not for something dressed up. Let me bring you one honest plate." The phrase hung there. Honest plate. Absurd in a dining room built to worship appearance. A capo seated halfway down the table let out a small, disbelieving laugh, then stopped when Nikolai's hand shifted on the linen. He had still barely touched anything all night, but now his attention moved in full and rested on Clara without blinking. Under that gaze, the room seemed to lose a few degrees. Candle flames trembled in their glass. Somewhere in the back, ice crashed into a metal bin. The floor manager gave a short, strangled sound. "She doesn't know what she's saying," he told the table, then to Clara in a lower voice. "You clear glasses. You do not speak to guests." The old humiliation was ready, eager, waiting to be used again. Clara felt it coming and stepped through the moment before it could pin her in place. "Then don't hear me as a waitress," she said. "Hear me as the only person in this room who isn't trying to impress him." The chef's face drained. For one reckless second, even he seemed to know she was right. The silver covers were lifted away one by stunned servers under her instruction. The soft clinks unnaturally loud as plates vanished, bread plates vanished, polished forks vanished, until the place setting in front of Nikolai was reduced to a plain bowl, a spoon, and an empty field of white linen. Luxury had been stripped down to usefulness. That was the true offense. Clara could almost feel the floor manager calculating the damage, not to the service, but to hierarchy. He reached for her elbow, not hard enough to make a scene, firm enough to remind her where she belonged. She pulled her arm free before he could guide her away. The move was small, but it changed the room. Several men at the table exchanged glances. The chef opened his mouth as if to protest, then closed it. Nikolai's eyes dropped briefly to Clara's hand, rough at the knuckles from soap and winter, then back to her face. 15 minutes for what?" he asked. His voice was low, almost bored, yet every sound in the room seemed to retreat around it. Clara took one breath. The air smelled of wax, wine, and cooling meat. "For something that doesn't pretend to be richer than it is," she said. "Something that tastes like it means to feed someone." No one laughed this time. The floor manager's smile finally cracked. He turned toward Nikolai with a quick half-bow, tried to recover control through polished language. "Sir, if you allow, we can prepare a replacement worthy of—" "I did not ask for worthy," Nikolai said. The interruption came without force, but it landed like a locked door. He looked at the bare place setting, then at Clara again. It was not trust in his face. Not yet. It was interest, which in that room felt almost as dangerous. 15 minutes, he said. No more. The chef inhaled sharply as if struck. The floor manager froze with one hand still half raised, authority suspended in midair. Clara gave a single nod and turned toward the kitchen, the noise behind the doors swelling to meet her. Burners hissing, knives tapping, someone dropping a ladle into a sink. As she pushed through the swinging door, every eye in the restaurant followed her, and the new pressure was worse than the old contempt. Before, they expected nothing from her. Now the clock had started. Hot air rolled out of the kitchen doors in greasy waves, carrying the smell of browned butter, garlic, and something faintly scorched beneath it. Copper pans rang against the stove line, ticket paper fluttered, and the bright white pass lights made every face look harsher than it had in the dining room. Clara had barely taken 3 steps inside before the floor manager caught her by the elbow and yanked her sideways, away from the line of cooks and into the narrow space beside a rack of polished plates. His grip was dry and sharp through the thin black sleeve of her uniform. "What do you think you've done?" he hissed, keeping his smile fixed for anyone glancing their way. "You don't speak to a guest like that." "Not him." The kitchen did not slow, but it listened. The chef stood rigid near the pass, one hand still holding a towel, his expensive jacket marked by a dot of sauce near the cuff. A dishwasher stopped stacking glasses. A prep cook lowered his knife. Under the hiss of stock pots and the metallic slap of ladles, the room tilted toward Clara as if waiting to see whether she would shrink back into the shape they had assigned her. The floor manager pulled her closer, his cologne fighting with the smell of onions and heat. "You fail, you're done. Not suspended. Not written up. Done. You walk out tonight and don't come back." He let the words land one by one, neat and cold, like utensils being placed in order. It was the first thing in that room that sounded honest. Clara looked past him toward the swinging doors, with a soft amber glow of the private dining room leaked through the narrow glass. 15 minutes. The number had already begun cutting itself smaller. Her paycheck covered a rented room with a window that didn't close all the way. It paid for bus fare, groceries, and the medicine her aunt stretched longer than the prescription allowed. Losing the job would not bruise her pride. It would strip the floor from under her life. The floor manager must have seen something move in her face, because his voice lowered with satisfaction. "Apologize now, and maybe I tell them you got emotional and confused. Keep going with this little stunt, and when he hates it, you'll have no one to blame." The chef finally spoke, not to defend her, but to defend the order of the room. "This is not a diner," he said, each word trimmed to precision. "A man like Nikolai Volkov is not served by improvisation and sentiment." Clara turned toward him. Steam drifted between them, softening nothing. "Then why is he still hungry?" she asked. A few heads snapped up. The chef's jaw tightened. That question did more damage than disrespect, because it named the failure no garnish could conceal. The floor manager's fingers tightened once more on her arm, then released with a disgusted flick, as if her courage itself offended him. He stepped toward the pass and raised his voice enough for the nearest staff to hear. Everyone listened carefully. "She has 15 minutes because he said so. If she humiliates this house, she leaves for good. If she succeeds..." He stopped there, because success had no place in the script he had prepared for her. "You heard me," he finished. "This is on her." For a second, no one moved. Then the doors swung open behind them with a soft thud, and one of Nikolai's men stood there in a dark suit that seemed to absorb the kitchen light. He did not step fully inside. He didn't need to. His eyes found the floor manager first. "Mr. Volkov said she is not to be interrupted," he said. His tone was almost polite, which made it worse. "If she asks for 15 minutes, she gets 15 minutes. The floor manager tried to recover himself with a brittle laugh. "Of course, we're only maintaining standards." The man's expression did not change, then maintained them quietly. He let the door fold shut behind him, and the kitchen exhaled only after the latch clicked. Power had moved again, cleanly and without argument. Not to Clara, not fully, but away from the hands that had been strangling the room all night. The floor manager's face blanched under the past lights. He looked at Clara the way people look at a candle near expensive curtains. Small, inconvenient, suddenly dangerous. Fine, he said. You wanted this? Do it. But you touch nothing from the tasting menu. Nothing from the main inventory without approval. And if you make me regret letting this happen, I'll make sure no one in this city hires you again. There it was, the price rising from one lost shift to an entire future. Clara did not answer him right away. She flexed her hand where his fingers had pressed a pale mark in her skin, then untied the fresh service towel from her apron and set it aside. The gesture was tiny, but it changed something. A waitress preparing to obey looked one way. A woman choosing her risk looked another. The kitchen around her resumed in fragments. Burners ticking, a spoon striking a pot rim, oil whispering in a sauté pan. But the center of the room held still as she stepped away from the polished chaos of the main line. No one invited her. No one offered help. That made the decision cleaner. She crossed toward the back prep station, the neglected corner near the old six-burner auxiliary range where staff meals were sometimes thrown together after midnight. Stainless steel, there was less perfect, scratched by use. The cutting board stained faintly with carrots and herbs. It smelled less like performance and more like labor. The chef called after her, voice edged with disbelief. You're not a cook. Clara stopped just long enough to glance back. Not the kind you trained, she said. No, he replied. It was meant as insult, but in that overheated corner, with the clock narrowing and the whole house balanced on the thin spine of one impossible chance, it sounded almost like permission. She checked the wall clock above the shelving. 13 minutes left. The floor manager folded his arms and planted himself where he could watch her fail. From somewhere beyond the kitchen doors came the muffled hush of the private room, a silence heavier than conversation. Nikolai was still waiting. Clara drew one breath through the smell of starch, steam, and old bread, then reached for the simplest tools in sight, knowing that the next thing she touched could either feed the man no one could satisfy or cost her the last steady thing she had. Butter hissed the instant it touched the iron pan, a small sharp sound beneath the larger storm of the kitchen, and the smell that rose from it was not luxury, but memory. Nutty, browned, almost sweet, the kind of scent that clung to old coats in winter and followed people home. Steam filmed the back station's dented metal shelf, turning the fluorescent light milky, while somewhere beyond the swinging doors crystal waited in silence, and a powerful man sat before an empty place setting. Clara moved into that neglected corner as if stepping into a chapel no one else respected. She did not reach for the expensive cuts resting under linen, nor the truffle oil the chef guarded like doctrine. Instead, she took the humblest things the kitchen barely noticed: 2 russet potatoes from a produce crate, a yellow onion with papery skin, a heel of day-old bread, a knob of butter wrapped in wax, coarse salt, black pepper, and a small carton of stock mint for staff meal. The chef saw what she was gathering and gave a short laugh without humor. You're making peasant food now. His voice carried over clattering pans and clipped orders meant to draw witnesses. Clara did not answer him. She set a pot on the flame, filled it with stock and water from the tap, and scrubbed the potatoes under a thin stream so cold it reddened her knuckles. Skin on. No garnish try. No silver dome. The choice itself changed the room. Cooks who had been pretending not to stare began to watch openly, because this was no longer a rebellion of words. It had become a plate with her name tied to it. The floor manager remained near the pass with his arms folded, but his threat no longer pushed the next move. That belonged to Clara now. She cut the onion fast, not with a trained flourish, but with the economy of someone who had learned to make enough from little. The blade hit the board in a steady wooden rhythm. Onion went into melted butter. Then the potatoes, rough cubes, pale and starchy. Salt between her fingers. Pepper cracked under the mill. When the stock came to a low murmur, she covered the pot and turned to the bread. Heat from the flat top pressed against her face. She spread butter on both sides with the back of a spoon, laid each slice down, and waited until the edges took color. Not perfect gold, darker than that. A little past safe, into the brown bitterness that made the rich smell richer. The butter foamed, then settled, and the bread gave off that deep toasted scent that belonged to small kitchens, old radiators, wet shoes by the door. For one suspended second, the noise around her seemed to recede, not because the kitchen had gone quiet, but because Clara had stopped cooking for witnesses. Her hands slowed over the pot. She lifted the lid, and a cloud of steam rose warm and earthy, carrying potato and onion and salt into the air with startling softness. With a wooden spoon, she pressed some of the potatoes against the side until the broth thickened naturally, leaving enough pieces whole to keep it from becoming elegant. Nothing in it shimmered for applause. It looked honest. A line cook beside her glanced down into the pot and then away too quickly, as though he had seen something private. Clara found a plain white bowl from the lower shelf instead of the restaurant's sculpted porcelain, warmed it with hot water, dried it with a towel, and ladled in the soup. Thick enough to hold heat, thin enough to be eaten when a person was tired. She cut the toast into rough strips, not decorative points, and set them across a small side plate. One last touch. She dragged the brown side of the bread lightly through the pan to catch the butter solids and the almost burned milk sweetness left behind. It was not refinement. It was truth made edible. The chef stepped closer then, drawn despite himself. "There's no cream," he said, as if listing a crime. "No wine. No finish." Clara finally looked at him. A sheen of steam lay across her face, and a strand of hair had loosened near her cheek. "That's the finish," she said, nodding at the bowl. "It ends where a real meal ends. When someone is warm." The chef's mouth tightened, but he had no vocabulary for fighting something that refused to perform by his rules. Near the doorway, one of Nikolai's men checked his watch and said nothing. That silence weighed more than any shouted order. Clara wiped the rim of the bowl with the corner of a clean cloth, steadied the plate of toast, and paused just long enough to feel what she was risking become solid in her hands. This was no longer only a job under threat. The dish carried her mother's winter suppers, the evenings when rent had been late and the apartment had still smelled of onion and butter before anyone spoke of worry, the unspoken promise that hunger could be met without spectacle. If the bowl failed, the city's polished dining rooms would remember exactly who had dared to embarrass hierarchy in front of Nikolai Volkov. If it worked, something even more dangerous might happen. A man used to obedience might ask for the truth again. The floor manager saw her turn toward the door and pushed off from the pass, as if to stop her one last time. He did not make it 2 steps. The guard nearest the hall lifted one hand, small movement, final meaning. The manager froze mid-stride. Clara walked past him carrying the bowl with both hands, careful and steady, while the back station she had borrowed stood behind her smelling of pepper, toasted bread, and scorched butter. Every eye followed her as she crossed from the hot fluorescent kitchen into the dim amber corridor leading to the private room. The temperature dropped there. Sound changed too, metal and shouting falling away until only the muted thud of her shoes and the faint clink of glass remained. At the end of the hall, the door stood partly open, and inside waited the long table, the untouched silver, and the man no one had been able to reach. She entered with one honest plate, and for the first time that night, the room had something more dangerous than failure in it, a taste that might be remembered. Amber light lay low across the private room, catching on polished silver and the thin skin of steam rising from the bowl in Clara's hands. Somewhere behind the closed door, the kitchen still rattled with pans and strained breathing, but in here the air felt cooler, padded by thick carpet, dark wood, and the faint scent of old whiskey trapped in crystal. She set the soup before Nikolai Volkov without flourish, then placed the butter-seared bread on a small plate beside it. No garnish, no towers of foam, no gold leaf, just a pale bowl, a rough slice of bread, and the smell of black pepper, onion, and brown butter settling into the room like something from another life. Nikolai did not reach for the spoon right away. He looked at the meal the way he had looked at every expensive failure that night. Head slightly angled, eyes unreadable, one hand resting near the stem of his glass. But there was a difference now. Nothing on the table glittered. Nothing begged to impress him. The soup simply waited. Clara stood a few feet away with her hands locked lightly in front of her apron, feeling the cooled edge of the serving cloth against her fingers. One of Nikolai's men remained near the wall, motionless in a black suit, his silence harder than any spoken warning. At the far end of the room, the floor manager lingered just beyond the threshold, blocked from entering but close enough to watch, his face pale under the hall light. Nikolai picked up the spoon at last. The metal made a soft click against the bowl, barely louder than a watch ticking. He stirred once, not to test the texture, but as if listening. The surface shifted, releasing another ribbon of steam. Onion, stock, potato, salt, nothing hidden. He took a small piece of bread first and dragged it through the butter, floating in a thin golden ring along the edge. Then he lifted one spoonful and tasted it. No one moved. Not Clara, not the guard by the wall, not the manager outside the door with one hand pressed against the frame. Nikolai's jaw stopped mid-motion. The spoon remained in his hand, suspended just above the bowl. A second passed, then another. His eyes, which had skimmed over every luxury set before him that evening with practiced indifference, lost their focus for the first time. The room did not change, but something inside it withdrew. The amber light on the table, the shine of the cutlery, the sealed windows, they all seemed to fall backward from him, as though he had stepped through them without rising from his chair. In their place came a smaller room, somewhere far from polished wood and armed men. A kitchen with cracked paint near the stove, winter pressing white against the dark glass, a radiator knocking in uneven bursts, a woman standing at a dented pot with her sleeves pushed up, stirring potatoes and onion and broth because there was little else in the house, turning stale bread in a pan with butter until the edges caught and browned. The smell had been the same, plain, warm, honest enough to make a cold room feel occupied. His mother had set down the bowl in front of him with work-rough hands and told him to eat before it cooled. That had been the last meal she made for him. By the next night, the apartment had filled with strangers' shoes, low voices, and the kind of silence that teaches a boy not to ask for comfort again. The spoon in Nikolai's hand trembled once, so slightly that only someone watching for danger would have seen it. Clara saw it. So did the bodyguard at the wall, whose chin lifted almost imperceptibly, not from alarm, but from disbelief. Nikolai lowered the spoon with care, as if setting down something fragile. When he spoke, his voice was quiet enough to make everyone else lean into stillness. Who made this? No one answered at first. The floor manager opened his mouth from the doorway, eager, almost desperate to control the room again, but Nikolai's man turned his head just enough to stop him cold. Clara felt the heat from the bowl fading now, felt the scent of butter and pepper mingling with the dry oak smell of the room, and stepped forward before anyone could lie for her. "I did," she said. Nikolai looked up at her then, fully, and the expression on his face was stranger than anger. Anger would have restored order. Anger was familiar. This was worse for everyone watching because it was human. His gaze searched hers, then flicked to the bowl again, to the bread, to the simple plate that had crossed a boundary no chef in the city had touched. "Where did you learn it?" he asked. Clara swallowed once. "At home," she said. "When winter got long, we made food stretch. Potatoes, onion, broth if we had it, bread and butter if there was butter." The words settled into the room without decoration, and something in Nikolai's face tightened, not against her, but against memory itself. He picked up the bread, broke off a corner, and ate it more slowly this time. The crust gave with a soft crackle. Butter shone briefly on his thumb before he wiped it away with a napkin. He took a second spoonful, then a third. The untouched glass near his hand remained untouched. Outside the door, a server carrying a tray slowed to a stop, sensing the silence before understanding it. In the kitchen beyond the corridor, a pan crashed loudly, but no one in the private room flinched. All attention had narrowed to the bowl, the man, and the waitress who had brought him something no one else had known he was starving for. Nikolai exhaled through his nose, long and unsteady, and set the spoon down again. This time he did not lean back. He remained bent slightly over the table, like a man listening to a voice he had not heard in years. "My mother made this," he said, and the sentence landed heavier than any threat he had spoken that night. The floor manager's face emptied in the doorway. Even the bodyguard near the wall shifted his weight, A minute adjustment that betrayed surprise more honestly than words ever could. Nikolai's fingers rested near the bowl, not possessive, almost reverent. The last time, he added, eyes fixed on the steam thinning above the soup, was the night before she was taken from me. No one interrupted him. Clara did not move closer. She did not offer comfort, and that restraint gave the moment its shape. The room held its breath around a man who had built an empire by never letting the past touch his voice, and yet there it was now, plain as the soup before him. He lifted his eyes to Clara once more, and what stood between them was no longer service. It was recognition, dangerous in a room built on obedience. "Stay," he said, not loud, not asked twice. The word did not go to the guard or the manager. It went only to her. And in the doorway, where humiliation had expected to reclaim its place, another tension began to gather instead, because now the entire restaurant had heard the impossible. The man no chef could reach had been stopped cold by a poor waitress's honest plate, and whatever he chose next would not leave the balance of that room the same. The clink of silver against china seemed louder now that no one dared speak. From the hallway came the faint hiss of the kitchen doors swinging shut, then the dry stop of leather saws as Nikolai's man stepped fully into the entrance and blocked it with the quiet certainty of a locked gate. The private room smelled of brown butter, black tea gone warm, and the last breath of potato soup still lifting from the bowl. Only then did Nikolai rise. The chair legs whispered over the darkwood floor, and every face beyond the doorway straightened at once. The city chef had already taken one hopeful step forward, jacket crisp, chin lifted, ready to claim whatever miracle had just happened under his roof. He never got the chance. Nikolai did not even look at him. He set the spoon down with care, wiped his fingers once with a linen napkin, and walked out of the room carrying not force, but something more unnerving tonight: intention. Clara stayed where she was for half a second, feeling the heat of the backstation still trapped in her palms, then followed when the bodyguard tilted his head for her to come. The dining hall beyond was drenched in low gold light. Chandeliers reflected in rows of polished glasses, every table empty except the one that mattered, and the staff lined along the walls like witnesses waiting for a sentence. The floor manager moved first, smile already built, voice ready to seize control of the story before it could leave his hands. "Mr. Volkov, I assure you, the chef can prepare a proper—" "No," Nikolai said, and the single word landed harder than a shout. The manager stopped mid-breath. Across the room, the city chef's expression tightened as if someone had pulled a thread through the seam of his pride. Nikolai's gaze passed over the plated towers, the edible flowers, the gleam of reductions painted like signatures across white porcelain. Then he looked at the bowl still in Clara's hands and at the plain slices of bread wrapped in a folded cloth to keep them warm. "You," he said to the chef at last, voice level as winter glass. 3 courses, 9 ingredients I could name from across the room. Salt without warmth, butter without memory, meat cooked to perfection and served dead. Nobody moved. Even the refrigeration hum from the service bar seemed to recede. The chef opened his mouth, closed it, then tried for dignity. "With respect, sir, fine dining is not meant to imitate peasant food." The insult was small, almost polished, but it carried. Clara felt it land across the room before anyone turned to see whether she would lower her eyes. She did not. Nikolai did, not toward the floor, but toward the chef, as if testing whether the man understood what line he had crossed. "And yet," Nikolai said, "the only honest things served in this building tonight came from the hands you would not let near your kitchen." The floor manager stepped in too quickly, the scent of sharp cologne cutting through the butter and broth. She acted without authorization. "We were handling the matter. If there was confusion, I take full responsibility, and she can be dismissed immediately." That was the old order trying to restore itself. Punish the weakest body in the room. Smooth the tablecloth. Call it discipline. But agency did not belong to him now. Clara shifted the bowl to one hand and spoke before he could bury her inside his apology. "Don't dismiss me to make this neat," she said. Her voice was not loud. It carried through crystal and velvet, and all the expensive silence money usually owned. Several staff members flinched on instinct. The manager turned toward her with a look that promised consequences later, private and thorough. "You do not speak now," he snapped. Nikolai's man moved one step, just enough. Leather creaked. The warning was wordless, and the manager's next sentence died unopened. Clara looked past him, not at the chef, not at the guards, only at Nikolai. The room had expected gratitude from her, perhaps tears, perhaps the trembling obedience of someone suddenly chosen. Instead, she set the bowl down on the nearest service table with slow, careful hands and wiped her fingers on her apron as though she were clearing space for the truth. "If you want someone imprisoned beside a stove, hire someone else," she said. A glass somewhere near the bar gave a tiny ping as it settled against another. "I'm not a pet miracle. I'm not a story your staff can tell tomorrow about how a poor waitress was discovered and kept." The words should have sounded reckless. In that room, beneath those lights, they sounded clean. Nikolai watched her without interruption. The pulse in his jaw moved once. "You speak to me as if refusing me were safe," he said. "No," Clara answered. "I speak to you because lying would be worse." A draft of cold air slipped in from the service hall and brushed the sweat cooling at the back of her neck. Nobody around them seemed to breathe. "You don't need richer food," she said. "You need 1 hour at a table where nobody performs for you." That soup worked because it wasn't trying to impress you. It told the truth, and you recognized it. The chef looked offended. The manager looked cornered, but neither of them owned the moment anymore. Clara did, and with every second she kept speaking, the cost rose beyond a single shift at a restaurant. This was reputation now, the kind that traveled through kitchens and private clubs, and every dining room where powerful men decided who would be hired and who would quietly disappear. Still, she did not stop. "What you've been swallowing every night isn't bad cooking," she said, her eyes steady. "It's loneliness dressed up as luxury." The words hit the room harder than any insult thrown all evening because they did not accuse his power. They named his emptiness. One of the servers near the wall lowered her gaze at once. The manager looked genuinely frightened now, not for Clara, but for himself, as though he could already hear his own future closing. Nikolai took 2 slow steps toward her. The amber light caught the scar near his wrist as he reached for the cloth-wrapped bread, not to eat, only to feel the heat still trapped inside it. When he spoke again, his voice had lost the ceremonial distance everyone in the room was trained to obey. "The manager is finished here," he said, without turning. The floor manager made a broken sound, half protest, half plea. "Sir, please, I was protecting standards." "You were protecting fear," Nikolai said. "And fear has made this place useless to me." The bodyguard opened the path with one arm, and the manager, pale under the golden lights, understood before anyone touched him that his authority had already been removed. He looked at Clara as if she had taken something from him with her bare hands. She had not. He had handed it away the moment he mistook cruelty for order. The city chef remained frozen, humiliated in a different way now, still employed perhaps, still decorated, but publicly stripped of the illusion that skill without humility could satisfy the one man he had built this evening around. Then Nikolai faced Clara fully. "From tonight on," he said, "no one prepares my evening meal but you." A murmur tried to form in the room and failed under the weight of his tone. It was not a reward spoken lightly. It was a command, a claim, a rearranging of lives. Clara held his gaze and did not nod. That refusal to rush toward favor changed something again, quietly but completely. The offer stood between them, powerful and dangerous at once. And for the first time since he had stepped into the restaurant, Nikolai looked like a man who understood that being obeyed and being answered were not the same thing. The chandeliers trembled faintly in the air current from the kitchen doors. Warm bread, cooling soup, linen, brass, old wood, all of it weighted with the staff along the walls as if the entire building had reached the edge of a sentence and could not yet hear how it would end. Wax and butter still hung in the air, and the chandeliers cast a honey-colored light across the polished wood as the whole room waited for someone to move first. Somewhere beyond the swinging kitchen doors, a pan settled with a small metallic tick, and even that faint sound seemed too loud inside the silence Nikolai had created. Clara stood where he had left his command between them, the cooling bowl on the table still breathing up steam, the crust of pan-fried bread gone soft at the edges. Then she took one step forward, not toward the seat he had claimed for her in his life, but toward the line that had to be drawn before any life could be rearranged at all. "I won't be owned," she said, her voice quiet enough that the room had to lean into it. The floor manager had already gone pale near the far wall, the famous chef staring at the table as if the humble meal itself had insulted years of polished training. But Clara did not look at either of them. Her eyes stayed on Nikolai. "I will cook for a man," she said, "but not for a cage. If I make your meals, I'll walk in and out by my own choice. No one speaks to me like I'm dirt. No one uses fear in place of manners. And if you want honesty on your table, it has to reach farther than the plate." A breath moved through the room like fabric being dragged across glass. One of Nikolai's men shifted by the doorway, leather creaking softly but did not interfere. Nikolai did not answer at once. He looked down at the bowl again, at the last spoonfuls of potato, soup gone thick at the rim, at the blackened gold smear of butter on the bread, at a meal so plain it would have been laughed out of any dining magazine in the city. It was the only thing he had finished in months. His hand, broad and steady enough to sign away fortunes or lives, rested beside the spoon as though the metal had become heavier than expected. "You speak to me like no one else does," he said at last. "Because everyone else in this room is afraid of what happens if they don't," Clara replied. "And that's exactly why none of this has worked." The words landed harder than shouting would have. The chef let out a faint scoff, half outrage and half disbelief. "This is peasant food," he muttered, unable to stop himself. "Bread, potatoes, burnt butter. That is what satisfies him." Nikolai turned his head only slightly, but the movement cut through the room sharper than a blade. "No," he said, "that is what tells the truth." The chef's mouth closed. The floor manager tried one final time, voice thin and trembling under polished manners. "Mr. Volkov, the girl is overstepping. She doesn't understand the privilege being offered." Clara answered before Nikolai could. "I understand it perfectly." She lifted her apron with both hands, untied it from her waist, and folded it once with careful fingers still smelling faintly of butter and onion. The cotton was worn smooth at the seams. It was not a dramatic gesture. That was why it struck so hard. She laid it on the nearest white linen tablecloth like a notice being served. "If respect is not part of the arrangement," she said, "then I'd rather leave with nothing than stay and be useful." That was the new cost now. Not the threat of losing a shift, not the humiliation of a manager's anger, but the real risk of walking away from the only door power had opened for her because the door had opened in the wrong shape. For a long second, Nikolai said nothing. The warm lights above them reflected in the dark window behind him, turning his outline into something split between shadow and gold. All his life, people had mistaken obedience for loyalty, silence for peace, luxury for care. On that table sat the first thing in years that had made him stop performing indifference. And standing in front of him was the first person willing to refuse him without begging, flattering, or trembling. He rose slowly from the chair. The sound of with legs against the floor made shoulders tighten all around the room. Clara did not step back. When he spoke, the command in his voice was still there, but it had shifted shape. "Then hear me clearly," he said. "You will not be owned." He glanced toward his man at the door. "If she enters my house, she enters through the front. If she leaves, no one stops her." His gaze moved to the staff frozen along the walls. "If anyone speaks to her with contempt, they answer to me." Then back to Clara, and now the room witnessed something rarer than any display of force it had expected that night. He asked instead of ordered, "Will you cook for me under those terms?" The silence that followed was no longer the silence of fear. It was the silence of a room watching power bend and not break. Clara looked at him for a long moment, measuring not the wealth in his suit or the danger stitched into his name, but the fact that he had changed one word that mattered most. She had not been told. She had been asked. The scent of brown butter still floated between them, softening into the colder smell of crystal, linen, and old money. "Yes," she said, "if what you want is real food and the truth that comes with it." A murmur almost rose again, then died under the sheer strangeness of what they had just witnessed. Nikolai gave a single nod. Not triumphant, not theatrical, almost weary. He pulled the chair back and sat once more, but this time the table did not look like a stage built to test servants and punish failure. It looked, for one fragile moment, like a place where a man might actually eat. Clara crossed the room, took the bowl in her hands, and without waiting for permission from anyone else, carried it back through the kitchen doors. The heat in the service corridor wrapped around her face at once, rich with stock, yeast, dish soap, scorched butter, and the steam from industrial sinks. No one blocked her path. No one barked an order. A few of the kitchen staff watched in stunned stillness as she cut another slice of bread, pressed it to a hot pan, and let the butter darken just to the edge of bitter before pulling it away. She reheated the remaining soup in a small pot, instead of remaking it with display. Nothing about the motion was ornate. Spoon, flame, salt, bread, bowl. Honest things. When she returned, Nikolai took the plate from her hands without looking at anyone else. The spoon touched porcelain. Steam rose. He tasted it while it was hot. No one in the room moved. No one dared dress the moment up with applause or explanation. He swallowed, and something in his face, not softness exactly, but the end of a long, hard brace, finally loosened. The loneliness that had sat at his table night after night, in silver and crystal, had not been starved by finer sauces or rarer cuts of meat. It had been fed for years by every polished lie that told him wealth could replace being known. This simple meal had done what no celebrated chef could do. It had reached the part of him that still remembered warmth before power, hunger before excess, and a mother before the machinery of violence turned every evening into a ceremony of emptiness. His hand settled flat against the linen, as if confirming that the table, the bowl, the bread, and even he himself were still real. Clara watched from across the room, not smiling, not bowing, only standing steady in the place she had won without asking to be lowered or raised. Nikolai looked up at her then, and for the first time that night, the cold authority in his eyes gave way to something quieter and infinitely more dangerous in its honesty. Relief. The room remained silent, but it was no longer the silence of people waiting for punishment. It was the silence that arrives when everyone present realizes they have just watched a starving soul recognize its own name. And that night, what satisfied Nikolai Volkov was not luxury, not obedience, and not even the meal itself, but the simple, unbearable proof that after all those years, he was still human enough to taste the truth.